Hello everybody. Today I would like to talk to you about a fun monogreen deck that I made just because I wanted to use some of the old cards that I have, and these cards are very nostalgic for me. I know that they are a lot of fun to play, and it's not necessarily a tier 1 deck. It's not necessarily very competitive, even though I could sometimes beat some of my competitive opponents' decks. It's just there to remind us what old school Magic is about. It's about nostalgia. It's about using the cards that you love and not necessarily trying to win all the time, because you could make some adjustments and make this deck just like hundreds of others. But this is just to enjoy the cards that you have. So, as I said, it is a mono green deck, and it contains a lot of forests. We've got 24 lands, which is a lot, but we've got some big guys here. We've got the Mox, obviously. We've got Llanowar Elves, 4 of them, which is very important for the ramp in this deck. Another staple card that we have is Elvish Archers. I always prefer Archers to Gothian Pixies, because these have first strike, and together they can hold off some of the powerful attackers of your opponent, and having the different pump spells that we have, I think Elvish Archers are better. We have Urnam Djinn, a play set of them. Obviously this is a very powerful card that we cannot ignore in a mono green deck, even though we have no ability to fight against the drawback of this card, because we have no Armageddon. And here is the fun thing, here is the fun part. Some of the less optimal creatures, some of the less powerful and less commonly played guys. The first of them is Tracker. As you know, Tracker is the creature that has the fight ability. For 2 mana and tap, he does an amount of damage equal to its power to target creature. Target creature does an amount of damage equal to its power to Tracker. So this is the fight mechanic as we know it nowadays. The problem is that he is tapped, but the opponent's creature is not tapped, and also you pay 2 mana. Now, you can imagine that using him to fight is probably not always a good idea when he's just 2/2. I mean, who can he actually kill without dying himself? But the good thing is that we have got Giant Growth, we have got Aspect of Wolf, and with all of that, he can be more or less powerful. So we've got some nice interaction here, and the good thing is that he can kill utility creatures, he can kill some of the big guys, just finish them off, and this is a card that can actually be feared by your opponents sometimes. So he did pass the test, being a more or less playable card. Gaia's Liege is a very interesting card. I love this card just for the picture, because when you have these monochromatic, almost monochromatic cards, which is purely green, green frame, green picture, surprisingly realistic by the way. If you look at this guy, I just imagine that this is a portrait of somebody's grandfather with some horns, let's say elk style horns or antlers, don't know what it's really called. So the best thing about him, of course, is that he can spoil your opponent's lands. He can turn them into forests. And I once had a match when I managed to turn a lot of my opponent's lands into forests. And it's not really to make him big, but to try and color screw your opponent, to maybe use this on your opponent's Mishra or Library of Alexandria, something like that. Definitely should make a deck with more of these, just try some fun interactions. Then we've got Force of Nature, that I always consider to be a star of these decks, because Force of Nature is extremely powerful. It's not always that I was able to use it, it's not always that I managed to summon these guys and actually live with them normally, because sometimes I would run out of mana because my opponent would destroy lands or some other thing would happen. But Force of Nature is obviously very powerful, and it just feels very powerful. The drawback is not too big for the effect that we have. Then, speaking of creatures, we've got a card which is not definitely popular. It's not popular at all. Grow Giant. And I think the reason is that because he has got 7 mana cost, which is a lot. He has Rampage. We'll have several videos about creatures with Rampage. We'll have one episode on creatures with Rampage, just dedicated to this ability, the really forgotten ability, because when you talk old school, you remember banding, but Rampage, certainly, it was not a popular ability. So for those of you who don't remember that, Rampage means that he gets +2/+2, because here it says Rampage 2, for each of the blocking creatures, but only after the first creature assigned. So basically, if he is fighting with some small guys, then he will get +2/+2 for each of these guys after the first one. So there was actually some case where it was more or less relevant. What is very important about him is that he has trample as well, not only Rampage. And I think this is the best of the uses of this ability, because if you don't have trample, then Rampage is pretty much useless. Your opponent can just chump block. And we have plenty of creatures who have Rampage but do not have trample. But with trample, your opponent should actually think, because if they assign, let's say, a couple of 1/1 creatures, then it's no use at all, because they will get even 1 extra damage from the Rampage ability. So he was more or less useful if I was able to manage to summon him. Then we've got another card, which is just there for fun, but again it was surprisingly powerful. Neil Sylvain, this is his name I guess, for 3 mana. He's extremely green. He's extremely green, 3 green to summon, 4 green to activate his ability. For 2/2 he can regenerate target creature, which is definitely relevant. I mean, if it was a little bit cheaper, the ability I mean, because it's perfectly fine to have a creature for 3 mana, which is 2/2 in old school Magic. I mean, sometimes we would have utility creatures that cost even more and maybe can be only 1/1, so that is fine. But the problem is that the ability is 4 mana and tap, so it can save your creatures from, let's say, Earthquake. It can save them from Mineral's Disc. I once had this very interesting interaction, and overall people just don't remember about him. And this is, this is the most beautiful thing about some obscure old school Magic cards, because when you play, your opponents, of course, they know Berserk, they know Library of Alexandria, they know Sylvan Library. I mean, they know all the staples. But these cards, even though I always explain what the card does to my opponent, I just show this card to my opponent so that they have enough time to look at it, actually examine it, and sometimes even remind my opponents of the abilities of the cards. But still, it is very difficult for people to keep in mind a card that has some special ability. And it can be a surprise factor, and this makes some of these underdogs cards a little bit more powerful, because the power of the surprise, especially when you have some abilities that they don't expect, because this is the ability that he basically gives to each of these creatures, right? They don't really think about these things sometimes. For example, some person can bolt one of your creatures, forgetting that you've got the regeneration ability. So, a really interesting thing. Killer bees. Killer bees are actually great. They're definitely underrated. And in casual games, they can be very powerful. I mean, I remember that I always used to think of these cards as pretty fearsome. And +1/+1 until end of turn, and flying. So essentially this is like Frozen Shade, but they do have flying. And it's not a problem that they can be pumped only for green mana, unlike Crimson Ants? No, not Crimson Ants, Carrion Ants, I think, that are 0/1 also, but black, and can be pumped for colorless. So Killer Bees, the beautiful thing about them is that they're flying, and we don't have many green flying creatures there. In this deck there are none. And sometimes they were pretty powerful, because again, it makes your opponent calculate how much you have, and sometimes people are not patient enough and they don't expect some kind of surprise factor, so they were pretty nice. As for non-creature cards, we had Aspect of Wolf. Aspect of Wolf is one of these nostalgia cards I decided to put here. Of course, it was very nice to put Aspect of Wolf on Tracker to make him more powerful. What does it do? Target creature's power and toughness are increased by half the number of forests you have in play, rounding down for power and up for toughness. So this is the unpleasant aspect of Wolf, so to say. This is the thing that you always have to keep in mind. How many forests have you got? So if you've got 4 forests, this will be how many? +2, right? But if you've got 5 forests, it will be +2, +3, because rounded down for power, rounded up for toughness, okay? So this is how it works. This card was pretty much okay-ish, I would say. Again, the problem with these auras, with these enchantments that you put on your own creatures to make them better, is that they usually cost you a card and your opponent can easily destroy the creature. Not even talking about disenchant here, because this is 1-for-1, but put a lot of good stuff on your creature and your opponent can just use swords to plowshares, and this is the worst aspect of these cards, unfortunately. But still, it was fun. Giant Growth, obviously have a playset of these. And we also have Sylvan Library. In this kind of deck, I used Sylvan Library not always aggressively, as I would, for example, in the red and green deck. But it was still quite a useful card, as you can imagine, because it is always useful, right? This is the on-to-include card in any deck that has green. I will go even further to say that it is worth including green in your deck just to have Sylvan Library. The most important card in this deck is still Berserk. And the interesting statistic is that I managed to win maybe 80% of all games that I won, only thanks to Berserk. I really counted that if I won, I usually cast Berserk. So maybe only a couple of times I won without casting Berserk, but if I did win, it was usually thanks to Berserk. Sometimes it was double Berserk, sometimes I would swing for about 20. So let's say we've got Force of Nature, Giant Growth, and Berserk. So you imagine that this is definitely for lethal or even more if your opponent doesn't have any blockers. And it only goes to show why Berserk was actually banned even for some time, and why they actually never reprinted this card in any modern sets, in any newer sets, and they came up with Double Strike instead of this. But this is still not the same thing, as you can imagine, because Berserk can be cast multiple times. As for Sideboard, as I said, I didn't really play this deck in tournaments, but I still had the Sideboard. I got Scavenger Folk, which I would run against decks that had a lot of powerful artifacts. I also, for the same reason, used Citadel Druid. Didn't really side them in normally. I also had Whirling Dervish, who was really powerful in many matchups when our opponent had black. And I also had Hurricane. Obviously that would hurt my bees if I did that, but I usually sided them out if I had Hurricane. So this is the deck that I've got. Again, it's nothing really special, but I find it to be very pleasant to play these green men, and you know, when we have such decks, everybody can use something of their own and play just for fun, not necessarily winning, but also not losing too often. I mean, it is more or less competitive to some extent, I mean. So that's it. Thank you for watching. I haven't made any videos in quite a while, as you can imagine, but I'm going to be more active, and I will be doing videos at least every week now. So stay tuned for more, and thank you for watching. Bye.